Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Madam President, I ask consent that I be able to engage in a colloquy with the senator from Hawaii for up to 20 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'm down here on the floor today with my colleague, Senator Schatz from Hawaii, to talk about our recent introduction of a piece of legislation entitled the College Affordability and Innovation Act, which we introduced along with our good friends Senator Murray of Washington and Senator Sanders of Vermont. And by way of framing the conversation that we'll have today, Madam President, I want to talk about one particular college that maybe paints a picture of the crisis that we are in today with respect to the mounting cost that confronts kids and families when they want to get a college education, and the variety of outcomes, the frankly surprising and often shocking variety of outcomes that students are getting when they show up at the doors of institutions of institutions of education, particularly institutions of for-profit education. Corinthian College is a college in California. It's not a small college. It's a pretty big college. It's got about 100 campuses on 25 different states. Let me give you some statistics about Corinthian College. After about a year, over half of the students who enroll drop out. When they're finished with their education, whether it be to a degree or not, about 1/3 of all students who go to Corinthian default on their student loans. If 56% isn't a bad enough number in terms of one-year dropout rates, after 4 years, only 6% of all the kids that walk in through the doors of Corinthian College get a degree. 6% of those kids. And affordability isn't an argument in favor of this school either. For a legal assistant degree, they charge $28,000, but down the street at a community college, you could get that same degree for $2,500. 35% default rate, 6% four-year graduation rate, degrees that can cost 14 times as much as comparable local schools. And guess what? The federal government rewards this school with $1.6 billion in federal aid every year and $500 million, in Pell Grant money every year. And so this example, which frankly can be repeated over and over again, especially in the for-profit world, speaks to the challenge that we have. We have done a really credible job over the course of the last few years in keeping down the interest rate that we charge students who want to take out loans to go to school. And no one has worked harder on this issue inside this body and outside this body than the presiding officer. But we also have to have a concurrent conversation about the sticker price of college, because it can't be enough that we are facilitating student borrowing. We actually have to try to engage in a real effort using federal levers for the first time perhaps in our history of federal higher education policy to push the cost of tuition down in the first place. And that's what the College Affordability and Innovation Act seeks to do. As Senator Schatz will talk about, there aren't a lot of issues that are much more important to the middle class than the cost of a higher education. And we both know that. We've partnered on this piece of legislation in part because, not only are we not that far away from the time in our lives when we were in college, but we are paying back our student loans and saving for our kids' education. So we get how much of an annual budget can be taken up in paying for both prior and saving for future college. And so we attack this problem in two ways. And I'll just briefly talk about the first way, and then I think the Senator from Hawaii can talk a little bit about the second method. First, we think that it's time for a little bit more innovation when it comes to the way in which colleges structure a degree. There's really no magic to the fact that today you have to sit in a classroom for 4 years taking a requisite amount of credits in order to get a degree. And there's a lot of interesting innovation happening out there where a small subset of schools are saying, wait a second, maybe there's a different way to do it. For instance, maybe we should award a degree based on the competencies you get, regardless of whether you need 2 years or 3 years or 4 years to get that degree. Or, for instance, maybe we should give students who show up at their freshman year of school with prior learning more credit for that, whether you got that experience studying at a high school or in the workforce or in the military. Some students don't have to start as a freshman. Some students can start as a sophomore or a junior. Or maybe it's a renewed effort to consolidate graduate programs with undergraduate programs. I think President Obama is right. You don't need 7 years to become a lawyer in this country. It doesn't make a lot of sense that you got to essentially spend 10 to 15 years in education and training to become a doctor. We can consolidate graduate and undergraduate programs. But whatever we do, we have to admit that one of the easiest ways to reduce the cost of a degree is to reduce the time that it takes to get a degree. And so the first part of our bill focuses on giving some grants to a small number of schools to build out the right way to do competency-based degree programming or initiatives to give greater credit for prior learning or consolidations of graduate and undergraduate degrees. We introduced this piece of legislation because we think it's time to start having a real conversation about what the federal government can do to control and lower the price of college education. It's breaking the bank for families. And we can do something about it. If we didn't have any tools at our disposal, maybe this wouldn't be a worthwhile conversation. But we give out $140 billion in federal aid every year, and it's about time that we start demanding some accountability for that money, whether it's accountability for cost or accountability for quality. It doesn't make sense for taxpayers to be sending $1.6 billion a year to a school with a 6% graduation rate, a 38% loan default rate, and prices that are simply not competitive in the landscape of college education. So I'm pleased to be down here on the floor with my colleague, Senator Schatz, and happy to turn the floor over to him.
Well, I thank the Senator from Connecticut for his partnership on this legislation. He's been a real friend and a true partner on this legislation. We're happy to have the support of Senator Murray from Washington and Senator Sanders, who have been working on this issue for a long time. But this really is the middle-class issue of our time. And it doesn't just belong to college-age students. It belongs to all of us. Senator Murphy talked about how important it is for those of us who have young children and are beginning the process of trying to save up for our children's college education. But it also belongs to the grandparents' generation. So many people are thinking about whether they can help their kids to ameliorate their existing student loans or their grandkids to be able to afford college. As Senator Murphy mentioned, we spend almost $150 billion in some form or fashion on federal financial aid for institutions of higher learning, and that's a good thing. That is a matter of national strategy. That is about the American dream. That is about the premise that the President talked about in his State of the Union, which is that if you work hard and you play by the rules, that you can move up the economic ladder. And higher education is one of the best ways to do that. It always has been in the United States of America. But here's the problem. And the Senator from Connecticut talked about an individual example, but let me give you the aggregate data. Over the last 10 years, we have spent 20% more, and we have gotten 25% less. We are spending 20% more, and we are getting 25% less. That means that although our investment in higher education and theoretically in college affordability has increased, the net cost for students has gone up by 25%. We now have more than $1 trillion in student loan debt. It's the second largest source of debt to mortgage interest debt. It has now outpaced credit card debt. This is a real crisis, not just on the consumer level, but as a matter of economic strategy for our nation, because to the degree and extent that young people or people who want retraining or people who want to get a culinary degree or become a master carpenter or become an architect or a doctor start to evaluate higher education and decide that it's not a good value anymore, that doesn't just impact their individual family or their individual community, but it impacts our national economic strategy. College is no longer affordable for many, many people, and that's despite the fact that we are spending more in raw dollars and in inflation-adjusted dollars than ever before. Senator Murphy talked about the innovation portion of this legislation. We also have an accountability portion of this legislation. And here's the basic premise. As an institution of higher education, if you're a for-profit, if you're a not-for-profit, or even if you're a public institution, it's not the federal government's job to determine what your mission may be. And certainly if you're a private for-profit, we're not here to dictate your organization's mission. But a for-profit institution has no special right to federal funding. And if you're going to receive billions of dollars in federal subsidies, we think it's reasonable, as we endeavor to reauthorize the Higher Education Act, that we tie some reasonable public policy strings to those dollars. And all we are saying is that we want institutions of higher learning, and especially their leadership, to wake up every morning and think not first about profits, not think first about how they're going to market to find more customers, but think about access and affordability. And what we're saying is that different institutions may have different missions. A community college has a different mission from a training institute, and a four-year institution has a different mission than a graduate institution. And that's all fine, and that's why we've established in this legislation an independent commission comprised of experts to determine what matrix of incentives and possible penalties would be appropriate for each institution. But here's the bottom line. We are spending more and getting less, and we are spending $150 billion. This system is not working, and we're pleased to have the support of several of our colleagues. We're going to be enlisting the support of many others, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with the senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Senator Schatz. Here's another statistic to think about. It wasn't so long ago where we ranked first in the nation with respect to 25-year-olds to 35-year-olds with college degrees, and that was not only a source of immense pride for this country, but really the genesis of our economic greatness, that we just turned out more college-educated young people than any other country in the world. In a very short period of time, we have slipped from first to not second or third or fourth, but to 12th. We are now 12th in the world with respect to the number of 25 to 35-year-olds with college degrees. Now, part of the reason for that is that a lot of other colleges, a lot of other countries have caught up to the United States. But the crisis in this country is no longer just a crisis of access. That was the buzzword for a long time, that we needed to increase access to college. We now have a crisis of completion in which millions of students are starting school and not finishing it for a variety of reasons, but largely because of the astronomical cost. Today, the majority of students are not graduating in 6 years. And so the issue about affordability is not just about attracting more kids into the doors of college, because I'll tell you, as I'm sure you do, Senator Schatz, I talk to a lot of kids who graduate high school and don't apply to school in my state because they are scared off by the cost, and they just don't believe that they're going to be able to put together the family resource to pay for it. But we also are losing a generation of workers because it's taking young people now 6, 7, 8 years to complete a degree. And often, many of them are never completing that degree while still taking on loan after loan after loan and getting stuck in the worst possible situation whereby they have thousands of dollars in debt and no certificate to bring into the workforce. And so, our effort here is an effort to address cost because we care about access, but it's also an effort to address cost because we care about completion, and that's one of the big problems that we have in our system today.
Well, I think you're exactly right about that one. Let me give you some data on, in 2011, only 38% of undergraduate students in a four-year institution graduated on time. And so when you think about the cost of college, you think about the per-year cost. But if it's taking 6 or 7 years, then the per-year cost is not as important as how realistic it is for you to finish on time. And this isn't, just to be clear, those data could be skewed by the fact that there are part-time students and all the rest of it. That's not what we're talking about here. It is simply hard to finish on time. But there is hope on the horizon. For instance, the University of Hawaii has undertaken a program called 15 to Finish. And the basic idea is that students especially in their freshman year, need to know that they need those 15 credits. They need to get help from their counselors so that by the time they're in their sophomore year, they are well on their way to completing their major of choice in their 4-year period of time. The challenge now is that given that legislatures have cut funding to institutions of higher learning, and as a result you have fewer counselors and fewer people to assist in the Student Services Office, oftentimes you don't get real counseling with respect to what you need until it's too late, and then you find that you're on a 5- or 6-year plan. Your family may not have made the financial arrangements that put you in a position to be on the 5-year plan, which means that now, from a revenue standpoint, if your mission as an institution, for-profit or not-for-profit, is just to fill those seats and to generate those dollars, then that doesn't matter to you. But the challenge we have right now is that the institutions have, the publicly traded ones have pressures to generate profits, but even the not-for-profits and even the public institutions, the universities of Hawaii and the University of Connecticut, have had their funding reduced by the legislatures. And so their CFOs are trying to figure out new revenue streams, and as long as they can keep enrollment up, that enables them to go back to their legislature and say, we're in the black. And what we're saying is that that's not good enough. We're not asking you to be in the black. We certainly understand the need to be fiscally responsible. We certainly understand the need to generate tuition revenue. But here's the thing. The point of higher education is for students to be able to move up that economic ladder. And to the extent that not only is it not accomplishing that goal, but it's actually doing the opposite for some of our students. They end up with a mountain of debt and either no degree or a degree that they find doesn't make them employable in the marketplace. That is a national shame. And that's why we have to address this. The good news is that we believe that we are spending a sufficient amount of money on the federal level so that we can effectuate these changes just by saying, if you want to receive federal dollars for your institution of higher learning, then we are asking you to focus on access and affordability. I want to give you one last piece of data because it actually shocked me, even as much as I've been working on this issue. The for-profit institutions comprise about 12% of the students and 30% of the federal dollars. 12% of the students and 30% of the federal dollars. And so while there are institutions that are for-profit that are doing great work, and there are not-for-profits and public institutions that have to do a lot better, let's call it like it is. One of the major challenges here is we have to wrap our arms around undue profits and publicly traded companies that are generating profits and spending federal dollars on marketing to students and not providing very much in the way of value.
And I think let's be clear about what we're talking about here. We believe we're talking about a pretty light hand of accountability in the sense that we are really going after the true outliers. You talked about the work happening at the University of Hawaii or the University of Connecticut. We don't imagine that any flagship university is going to run afoul of these accountability standards. I frankly don't believe many public universities at all are going to run afoul of these standards. We're really talking about the handful of outliers that have just absolutely abysmal retention rates, graduation rates, default rates, or tuition increase rates. And we're also talking about, we think, a pretty nuanced process by which to try to bring those schools around before they would lose eligibility for funding. Our bill says that if you're not meeting these standards, you'd have a pretty long period of time in which you'd be on probation with no practical effects, in which you could set upon an action plan to improve your affordability or outcomes. And then if after that period of time you still weren't hitting your benchmarks, then you'd lose 10% of your federal aid, then 20%, and then finally in the 4th or 5th year is when you would become ineligible. That's plenty of time for a university to correct. But if a school that's starting out with a 6% graduation rate can't improve that over 5 years, why on earth would we continue to send $1 billion to that school when it could be used for students who are attending schools that care a lot more about quality education?
Well, I think you're exactly right, and we had the senator from Indiana talking about debt and deficits and making sure that we spend every federal dollar intelligently. And right now, we're simply not spending this money in the most efficient and efficacious way possible. And that's what this legislation is about. It actually, Senator Murphy and I talked about how it might have been a little more politically satisfying in the short run to put hard caps on college tuition and precipitous goals that would have been very easy for us to articulate. But the fact is, given that you have different institutions with different missions and you have great work being done at a community college level, at the certificate level, and at the and at the four-year and at the graduate level, that we wanted to account for the different missions, and we wanted to make sure that we didn't create the kind of incentive program that, for instance, would prevent an institution from wanting to take a kid in who's from a lower income area and may be, statistically speaking, more likely to default on his or her loan. And we really want, as a matter of policy, to focus on access. So it's access, it's affordability, it's the consistency with the mission. But here we are spending $150 billion more than we ever have on this national priority, and our results are worse than ever. And so the status quo cannot stand, and I'm really looking forward to working with my colleague on this important issue.
As we wrap up our time on the floor here, you know, when my great-grandfather came to this country, he knew that without a college education, he could get a job pretty easily that would be able to put food on the table, have decent health care for his family, even provide him with a little bit of a pension that would take care of him. And his son, my grandfather, followed him into that same profession, working for a ball bearing factory in New Britain, Connecticut. Now, while those jobs still exist, they are getting rarer and rarer. And for the next generation to succeed, we know they need access to a college degree. They're not getting that access to completion because we have been woefully inadequate in using the tools at our disposal at the federal level to try to put pressure on colleges to deliver on both affordability and outcomes. And we hope that the introduction of the College Affordability and Innovation Act will allow us to open up a new front in the debate on higher education to promote the idea of reducing the sticker price of college. I thank my colleague for joining me, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
I ask unanimous consent to speak for about 15 minutes, perhaps as many as 17 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you so much. I come to the floor today for the 57th consecutive week that the Senate has been in session to urge my colleagues to wake up to what carbon pollution is doing to our atmosphere and oceans. I have described Congress as surrounded by a barricade of lies. Today, I'll be more specific. There isn't just lying going on about climate change. There's a whole carefully built apparatus of lies. This apparatus is big and artfully constructed. Phony baloney organizations designed to look and sound like they're real. Messages honed by public relations experts to sound like they're truthful. Payroll scientists whom polluters can trot out when they need them. And the whole thing big and complicated enough that when you see its parts, you could be fooled into thinking that it's not all the same beast. But it is. Just like the mythological Hydra, many heads, same beast. So this speech is going to be about that beast. A recent research article published by Dr. Robert Bruhl, a professor of sociology and environmental science at Drexel University, describes the beast. He joins a tradition of scholarship in this area, including work by Naomi Oreskes, Aaron McWright, and Riley Dunlap, each of whom has studied the forces behind climate denial, and David Rosner and Gerald Markowitz, who explored chemical and lead industry campaigns to deceive Americans about the dangers of those products. The intricate, interconnected propaganda web and funding network of this climate denial beast encompasses over 100 organizations, including industry trade associations, conservative think tanks, and plain old phony front groups for polluter interests. It has even co-opted media outlets, a phenomenon I chronicled in an earlier speech about the Wall Street Journal editorial page becoming a tool of polluter propaganda. So let's take a look at this climate denial beast and how polluter money and dark money flow through its veins. This chart from Dr. Bruhl's report shows the complex interconnection of the beast's major players. The green diamonds are the big funders, the Koch-affiliated foundations, the SCAFE-affiliated foundations, the American Petroleum Institute, and so on. And the blue circles are the who's who of climate denial groups. The Heartland Institute, they're the group that compared folks concerned about climate change to the Unabomber, just to give you a sense of what sort of people they are. The American Enterprise Institute, right here. The Hoover Institution, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Mercatus Center, to name just a few. The purpose of this network, to quote the report, is, and I'll quote, a deliberate and organized effort to misdirect the public discussion and distort the public's understanding of climate. To misdirect and distort. The coordinated tactics of this network, the report shows, and I'll quote again, span a wide range of activities, including political lobbying, contributions to political candidates, and a large number of communication and media efforts that aim at undermining climate science. That is the beast. And big money flows through it. More than $500 million. The Drexel University report chronicles that from 2003 to 2010, 140 foundations made grants totaling $558 million to 91 organizations that actively oppose climate action. It looks like a big beast to build just to propagate climate denial. But if you look at carbon emissions from fossil fuels, which in 2011 EPA estimated to be over 5.6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide. So take 5.6 billion tons of carbon dioxide and then multiply that by the social cost of carbon, the economic and health costs that the polluters cause and inflict on the rest of society, which OMB recently set at $37 per metric ton of CO2. 5.6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emitted, $37 per metric ton of CO2 in social cost of carbon. Just 1 year's emissions will cost roughly $200 billion with a B dollars. 1 year's. So the stakes are pretty high for the polluters. If they were to pay for the harm that they're causing, $500 million through the beast over 7 years to get away with $200 billion of harm every year, It's a bargain. And more than that, a lot of this machinery was already built. The beast did not spring up at once, full-grown. It grew over time in industry-fueled campaigns to obscure the dangers of cigarette smoke, of acid rain, of ozone depletion. Who knows? There are probably parts of it that go back to fighting the benefit of requiring seat belts and airbags in cars. Looking back on the effects of these industry-funded campaigns of denial, we see that real people were hurt. But the denial machinery stalled action and made the wrongdoers money. It worked. So now, the climate denial machine, the beast, is calling plays from the same playbook and even using many of the same front organizations. So who is behind this beast? Unfortunately, for proponents of transparency, a large portion of the funding is not traceable. Much of the money fueling the beast is laundered through organizations which exist to conceal donor identity. Some of the organizations examined by Dr. Brule get over 90% of their money from hidden sources. Indeed, more than a third of these organizations get over 90% of their money from hidden sources. The biggest identity laundering shop is Donors Trust and Donors Capital Fund. Indeed, it is by far the biggest source of funding in this web. These twin entities reported giving a combined $78 million to climate denier groups between 2003 and 2010, and they refuse to identify their funders. According to the Drexel report, the Donors Trust, Donors Capital Fund operation does double duty. It is the, quote, central component and, quote, predominant funder of the denier apparatus, and at the same time, it is the, quote, black box that conceals the identity of contributors. Interestingly, anonymous funding flowing into the beast through Donors Trust and Donors Capital Fund has grown in tandem with disclosed funding from fossil fuel polluters declining. Anonymous dollars up, disclosed dollars down. As we see here, Donors Trust and Donors Capital donations to the beast went from 3% of all foundation funding in 2003 to more than 23% in 2010. At the same time, for example, the Koch brothers affiliated foundations declined from 9% of all foundation funding in 2006 down to 2% by 2010. And the same is true for other polluter-backed foundations. The ExxonMobil Foundation, for instance, wound down its disclosed funding of organizations in the climate denier network and basically zeroed out by 2007. It makes perfect sense. Why would the Koch brothers and Exxon come under fire for obviously funding climate denial when Donors Trust and Capital creates a mechanism for polluters to secretly fund the beast? Plus, the phony baloney front organizations within the beast, they can pretend that they're not funded by polluter money. Everybody wins in this identity laundering charade, except the public, of course, whom this elaborate construction is designed to fool. The product of this denial apparatus is a complex ruse to delegitimize the science that supports curbing carbon emissions, foisted on the American people with all the financing and fantasy of a Hollywood blockbuster production. Here's Dr. Brule describing what you see when you look behind the actors who appear in the media spotlight. I will quote, "The roots of climate change denial go deeper. Just as in a theatrical show there are stars in the spotlight, in the drama of climate change denial, these are often prominent contrarian scientists or conservative politicians. However, they are only the most visible and transparent parts of a larger production. Supporting this effort are directors, scriptwriters, and most certainly a series of producers in the form of conservative foundations." Frankly, Madam President, this apparatus is a disgrace. When the inevitable happens and the impact of climate change really starts to hit home, people will want to know. Americans will want to know. People around the world will want to know. Why we didn't take proper steps in time. It's not as if there's not enough scientific evidence out there for us to act. Why not? This denial operation, the beast, will then go down as one of our great American scandals, like Watergate or Teapot Dome, a deliberate, complex scheme of lies and propaganda that caused real harm to the American people and to our country, all so that a small group of people could make more money a little longer. And the fact that one of our great political parties is in on the scheme will be to its lasting shame. There's an old hymn that says, "Turn back, O man, forswear thy foolish ways." It is time for our denier colleagues to turn back and forswear their foolish ways. If they don't, there will be a day of reckoning and a harsh price to pay. Every day, more and more Americans realize the truth, and they increasingly want this Congress to wake up. They know climate change is real. As the President said in his State of the Union address, the debate is settled, climate change is a fact. Sir Winston Churchill once said this, "Owing to past neglect, in the face of the plainest warnings, we have now entered upon a period of danger. The era of procrastination, of half measures, of soothing and baffling expedients, of delays, is coming to its close. In its place, we are entering a period of consequences. We cannot avoid this period. We are in it now." End quote. Well, we are now in a period of consequences. We have got to break the back of the beast and break the barricade of blandishments and lies that beast has built around Congress. This campaign of denial, this beast, is as poisonous to our democracy as carbon pollution is to our atmosphere and oceans. With money and lobbyists and threats, it has infiltrated itself in an unseemly way into influence over our government. For the sake of our democracy, for the sake of our future, for the sake of our honor, it is time to wake up. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Utah.
Madam President, I'd just like to take a few minutes to talk about our nation's international trade policy. Specifically, I wish to discuss efforts to renew Trade Promotion Authority, or what we call TPA. The most recent authorization of TPA expired nearly 7 years ago. Since that time, Republicans have, by and large, expressed support for renewing it. In August 2010, the U.S. Trade Representative Ron Kirk testified that the Obama administration needed TPA to conclude ongoing trade negotiations. However, after that time, little was done to move the ball forward on renewing TPA. So in September 2011, Minority Leader McConnell and I offered an amendment on the Senate floor to renew Trade Promotion Authority for President Obama. Unfortunately, despite strong support from the Republican caucus, a number of Democratic senators actively opposed our efforts, and it received virtually no Democrat support. As a result, our efforts failed. In March 2013, then-acting USTR Moranis again expressed the administration's support for renewing TPA and pledged to work with Congress to get it done. In June 2013, USTR, United States Trade Representative Michael Froman, during testimony before the U.S. Senate Finance Committee, formally requested on behalf of President Obama that Congress renew TPA. Throughout most of the 2013, I worked with Chairman Baucus and Chairman Camp of the House Ways and Means Committee to craft a bipartisan bill to renew TPA, one that could pass through both houses and the Senate. We introduced our bill in January. Last week in his State of the Union address, President Obama asked Congress to pass TPA legislation so that his administration could complete negotiations on two very ambitious and important trade agreements. And while I thought President Obama could have spoken more forcefully on this matter, his call for TPA renewal was clear and unambiguous. Yet so far, the call appears to be going unheeded since, or should I say, among Democrats in the Senate. Why is TPA so important, Trade Promotion Authority? I think some additional context is necessary here. The administration is currently in the midst of negotiations on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, an Asia-Pacific trade agreement that is currently being negotiated between the United States and 12 other countries, including some of the world's largest economies, such as Japan, Canada, and Mexico. The Asia-Pacific region represents more than 40% of the world's trade. And as a group, TPP countries represent the largest goods and services export market for our country, the United States of America. On the other side of the world, the U.S. is negotiating a bilateral trade agreement with the 28 countries of the European Union. This is called TTIP. The United States and the EU generate over half of the world's economic output. Total goods trade alone, however, between the U.S. and EU, amounts to over $1 trillion a year. Investment flows represent another $300 billion on top of that a year. Together, these two trade agreements have the potential to greatly expand access for U.S. products into foreign markets around the world. Most importantly, they would help to grow our economy and create jobs here at home. These two separate trade agreements and negotiations represent what is the most ambitious trade agenda in our nation's history. While everyone knows that I'm a pretty outspoken critic of the Obama administration, I believe the administration deserves credit on this front. But if these negotiations are going to succeed, Congress must approve TPA. Because of the unique structure of our government, our country needs TPA. Our trading partners will not put their best deal on the table unless they know that the United States can deliver on what we promise. TPA empowers our trade negotiators to conclude agreements and provides a path for passage in Congress. That is why every president since FDR has sought trade promotion authority. No economically significant trade agreement has ever been negotiated by any administration and approved by Congress without it. Put simply, if Congress does not renew TPA, the TPP negotiations and the TTIP negotiations with the European Union will almost certainly fail. That is why it is so disconcerting to me to see how some of my colleagues across the aisle have responded to the President's call for TPA renewal. TPA is one of the few issues where both parties can and should be able to work together to achieve a common goal. I know that I, along with my Republican colleagues, stand ready and willing to work with the administration to approve TPA as soon as possible. And I think I have a reputation of working across the aisle and bringing people together. This is one I'd like to bring people together on, and I shouldn't even have to argue about it. But I do. I believe the bipartisan bill Chairman Baucus and I recently introduced to renew TPA would receive strong bipartisan support in the Senate if it were allowed to come up for a vote. Indeed, I am confident that the vast majority of my colleagues would join me in supporting the bill, both Democrats and Republicans. The problem is Republicans are not in the majority in the Senate. It is the Democrats that control the agenda. And unfortunately, the President's call to renew TPA does not appear to be a priority for some of the Democrats, certainly the leadership of the Democrats. The question is, will Senate Democrats work with the President on this issue? I don't know the answer to that question, but I have to say that things don't look very good to me. Instead of robust support for the President and his trade agenda, the response we've seen from some Democrats has ranged from awkward silence on TPA to outright hostility. Needless to say, I'm extremely disappointed by this. Madam President, the issue here is fairly simple. If we want to grow our economy through trade, the Congress must approve TPA and do so soon. The President can play a unique and key role here. By forcefully advocating for TPA renewal, he can help turn some of the skeptics in his party around. Recently, the Financial Times published a powerful editorial which outlined the need for TPA and the role the President must play for TPA to succeed. According to the editorial, quote, 20 years ago, President Bill Clinton pulled out all the stops to push through approval of the controversial North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement with Mexico and Canada. He was able to squeak through a narrow victory by deft lobbying of lawmakers and a willingness to make a strong case for globalization to the American public. Mr. Obama is lagging behind his predecessor on both counts. The case for TTIP and TPP are both strong. The time for Mr. Obama to move these arguments has arrived. He has every incentive to succeed. Failure to secure TPA would be a grievous blow to his presidency, unquote. Now, I understand that there are some powerful political forces that lead some of my friends on the other side of the aisle to oppose international trade. However, let's be clear. If we fail to approve TPA, we will be doing our nation and our economy a great disservice. International trade is a good thing for our country. It is one of the few tools Congress has to grow our economy that does not add to the federal deficit. Madam President, as I mentioned, Senator Baucus and I, along with Chairman Camp, have negotiated and introduced a bipartisan, bicameral TPA bill. It is, in my opinion, the only TPA bill that stands a chance of getting passed in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have a choice. They can either work with the Republicans to pass our bill and empower our country to complete these important trade agreements, or they can throw up more roadblocks and cast more uncertainty on the President's trade agenda. As I stated, Republicans stand ready to work with President Obama on these issues and to help these trade negotiations to succeed. For the sake of our country and our economy, I sincerely hope my Democrat colleagues and friends here in the Senate are willing to do the same. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Kansas.
Madam President, today I come to the floor to discuss the recent report by the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, which contains updated estimates of the insurance coverage provisions of the Affordable Health Care Act, also known as Obamacare. It was just on Sunday the President told Bill O'Reilly, Fox News, in front of all America, Super Bowl Sunday, that his health care bill is working. Today, the Congressional Budget Office has changed that tune. We learned from the report that Obamacare will now cost us $2 trillion. $2 trillion. You may recall President Obama told the country his bill would cost less than $1 trillion. We also learned that we are expected to lose 2.5 million full-time jobs over the next 10 years. And finally, the CBO says exchange subsidies under the ACA will reduce incentives to work. Let me go over that again. President Obama told the country his bill would cost less than $1 trillion. Now CBO says it'll be $2 trillion. We're expected to lose 2.5 million full-time jobs over the next 10 years. And finally, CBO says exchange subsidies under the ACA will reduce incentives to work. If this is working, what does broken mean to this president? As I am reading the report and accompanying reaction, the most recent updates sound hauntingly familiar. In fact, I believe this is something that I and my colleagues spoke about every day during the debate on health care reform. We questioned at that time whether the CBO estimates accurately reflected the impact of Obamacare on the American people, which leads to why I am here on the floor as of this evening. This is about accountability, folks. During the debate, we questioned whether the scoring done by the CBO was fraught with gimmicks or an unrealistic belief that Medicare would achieve significant savings in the future. I have serious concerns with the accuracy of the scoring done on Obamacare and its portrayal of the impact of this legislation versus the stated benefits for the American people. We cannot keep doing this. There are people's lives at stake. People's lives that we're dealing with here. CBO projections during the health care reform debate seem to significantly underestimate the negative impact of Obamacare. And because of those projections, supporters were able to jam it through one vote. Everybody knows about that vote. And now the American people have to pick up the tab on the CBO's errors. Today, I am calling for hearings in the Finance Committee, upon which I sit, to demand CBO come before the committee and explain to Congress and the American people why and how its scores, which led to the passage of Obamacare, did not tell the whole story. This is about accountability for past actions, and we must ask the question, the difficult question, an unfortunate question. Was this political? Were the books cooked? CBO needs to take the responsibility for the differences between their projections and the most recent updates just released as of this morning. We must have accurate estimates on the costs and benefits of the legislation so we can do our jobs. This shouldn't be about politics or gaming the system. This is about people's lives, and it's our responsibility to get that right. Let the hearings begin. Let the CBO provide answers. CBO must answer this Congress and America. I yield back, Madam President.
Senator from Kansas.
It occurs to me after careful inspection that a quorum is not present.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. say aye.
dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent